So, hi everyone, welcome to our 13th Village in the City call. And my name's Mark McCurgo, and I'm the founder of Village in the City. And I'm very pleased to welcome Nigel Gann today as our special guest. And Nigel's going to be talking about how to create welcoming and hospitable communities, which he's involved with in Lichfield as the leader of, or one of the people involved anyway, in their City of Sanctuary movement, which is a UK nationwide endeavour. And so we are looking forward to hearing about that. We're going to have a few, some words from Nigel, some questions, breakout rooms, and then further discussion. And Nigel will also be telling you about his new book, which is perhaps not entirely connected with these things, but is nonetheless worth reading. So I've just got a few things to say about first of all, our next call, which is on Wednesday, the 13th of October, and it features, for a change, me. I'm organising Village in the City, but I also have a life as a management consultant and working with with the idea of leading as a host. And I think hosting and community building sit very well together. So I'm stepping forward this time. Now, rather than just hosting the call, I'm actually going to talk about my research into what good hosts do and how we can think about that and use that as a really good basis for community building in our own neighbourhoods. That's the 13th of October at 6 p.m. UK time, 2 hours later than the normal time for various operational reasons, 13th of October. The other thing is that our next Village Builder course is starting on the 19th of October, which is a 6-week course. And indeed, Terry and Leah both did the last one. So you've got a chance to, so I don't know whether we put you on the spot, but whether you'd like to say a word or two about your experience of the course, folks. That would might be interesting. Or possibly not. I'm just going to put the booking link in the chat for the course.
I have a mouthful of biscuits. Sorry.
Leah, give us a sentence about your experience on the course.
Now,
yes.
Now.
Just a sentence about how good it was.
Yeah. Let me see. Maybe one good thing. Many good things, but one good thing was that two good things. One is that I got in touch with people who are doing communities or perhaps want to do communities. And this is heartwarming, apart from being a learning experience, because you learn from others, but it is heartwarming. I myself, yeah, I thought I was quite isolated here, but by and by I find out about people here in my country, not necessarily in Sofia, who are doing more or less the same thing. And this is very heartwarming to find people who, I don't know, who are trying to do what you're trying to do. And also the course conceptually managed to capture the practice I'm in. And when you are aware of concepts and you put names to actions, this is always very useful. So these are two experiences which I can think of now. You're doing something and you're doing it as you go. But when there's a concept, when you see the philosophy behind it, it becomes a different animal.
Thank you, Leah. So that's starting on Tuesday, the 19th of October, the next running of our Village Builder training for 6 weeks, or with calls on Tuesdays at 6 p.m. UK time. Right. Let's begin to hand over to Nigel. So Nigel Gann, our speaker for today, I met him first. He came on a program about solution-focused coaching and change with us. Must be more than a decade ago now. He's a former head teacher. He's very, very aware about learning and environments and creating environments that connect people. And I'm absolutely delighted that he's been able to be with us today. So, Hospitable Communities, Nigel, over to you.
Thank you, and it's nice to be here. I like a nice small group, so we'll make it a conversation. And do interrupt if you want to say something. That's fine. I'd planned to talk for about 10 minutes. I witter a bit, so it'll probably turn into 15. But I'll just make a few connections first, because I like the idea of doing community, Leah. Thank you for that. I've been doing community for about 55 years. I didn't know I was doing community for the first 10 or 15 years of that. And then when I was working in what we call in England, or used to call community schools, that was schools which also provided adult education, youth work, and often preschool work, and a whole range of community activities, and also leisure and social activities. I was doing community seriously from around about 1979 onwards. And looking at different models around England, Scotland, and eventually abroad, of schools that saw their function as being, in a sense, educating the whole community, certainly giving the entire community access to education as well as social and leisure activities. And that has an honourable history in English education. But is pretty well dead now. And actually, so I'll plug the book now, because yes, this book is very connected with our topic today, because I'm just going to go right there. It is the Great Education Robbery. The government in the last 10 years has taken more than 3/4 of secondary schools in England and about 1/3 of primary schools away from their communities and given them to corporate and self-perpetuating trust boards, some of which are excellent, but many of which are run by hedge fund investors and by non-educationalists who are doing it for the money, basically. And although they are, strictly speaking, non-profit making, there is a lot of money to be made out of education on the fringes without actually making people pay for it directly. So a lot of the money in education in England that is meant for children goes into the pockets of hedge fund investors and also sort of fat cat chief executives and so on, many of whom have oddly and entirely coincidentally have very close connections with members of the government. So that's the Great Education Robbery is about how that process happened. First of all, in a very small community, a little village in Somerset, very near to where I used to live. Yeah, I mean, losing the concept of a village, taking a village to raise a child is absolutely right. And we have, in effect, I think, lost that in education now. Yes, I tell the story of how a school, little village school, is taken away from its community in South Somerset. And then I explore how that is happening nationally. And actually the skills, the craft that was learnt by the politicians and the officials, the officers, the local council officers, in deceiving the public and taking their school away, were used in both the run-up to the Brexit referendum and have been used throughout the pandemic, and include concepts like cronyism and centralisation of decision-making and so on. So I'm told it's a good read. One of the people who's reading it at the moment for review and is the leader of a trust on Dartmoor has said he couldn't put it down, which shows, you know, when I sent him the book, I did smear it with super glue, so that may have had something to do with it. So, okay, so I'm as usual when I do work like this, I draw a lot of threads together. So I'm also using the thread of host leadership that Mark mentioned, and is one of his many babies out in the world at the moment. And I've been really interested in that concept of host leadership, because I think also I was at least attempting to do that, and had been for about 40 years, again, without giving it a name, but certainly trying to run schools mainly and education projects in a way that they were owned by the community rather than by the authority or the funding council or whoever it happened to be who was putting the money up for it. And so how to hand organizations over to the people that they serve has been a constant interest of mine. So what we're going to look at very quickly is slide 1, please, Mark. We're going to look at what we might mean by host leadership in the community. There it is. I'm going to talk a little bit about Lichfield City of Sanctuary. Is there anybody who's ever heard of Cities of Sanctuary before? Only Mark, that's fine. Okay, right, good. We're going to talk about the fact that we're all migrants, and we're going to then sort of finish up with this concept that we're working on in Lichfield, which I've begun to call a welcome ready community. So can I just compare this to the elements of host leadership? Mark may have shared with you slide 2, which is his exploration of the elements of host leadership. And he mentioned the term stepping forward just now in terms of doing a presentation here next time. But the host leader does these things, and they are in a sense opposed to each other. They are in a sense antonyms, but they are critical in developing the concept of host leadership. So the host leadership steps forward by defining the event or the organization, in our case with the City of Sanctuary, or the project or the campaign that they are giving birth to. And then they step back and allow other people to respond to that and to take hold of it and to shape it in the way that suits their community. Stepping forward involves the host leader engaging people and making provision for them, like in a party. You provide the canapes, you provide the music background, and then you let people get on with it, and you join in with the party with a bit of luck. And if you can catch a couple of canapes as they go around, then all the better. The host also has to define what the boundaries are, what this is about. What are the things that you're going to be interested in and to activate? What are the things that are going to be beyond your brief? But while you're doing that, the host leader is also saying, but we must constantly be looking out beyond our brief and seeing who else might be involved and what else might be involved. And the host, as you know, is suggested really, is usually the first person in the building, the first person in the group, the first person in the organization, first person in the community to come up with this idea, to shape it and to offer it to participants. And as always, they're the last person to leave. And when I stopped being a head teacher, I said rather grandly, you know, I wasn't going to sweep floors anymore at the end of the kids' discos or or when the caretaker was off. I wasn't going to be the last one locking up anymore. That hasn't turned out to be entirely true. I've swept a few floors since. But being the first and being the last gives you the capacity to shape, to say this is where it starts, this is where it ends, these are the boundaries. Okay, so a few years ago, if we move on to the next one, please, Mark. Very quickly, history of City of Sanctuary UK. In Sheffield in 2005, Sheffield is a city in the north of England, pretty well deindustrialized now. It used to be the centre of the steel industry, and is now post-industrial. And one of the inevitable recipients of refugees and asylum seekers. as I guess in most countries, when those few in this country and those few refugees and asylum seekers are allowed in, they end up in very often in the poorest communities, where housing is cheapest and most available, where there are spaces on school lists and surgery lists and so on, where there's a capacity to take them. And of course, when that happens, they're then accused of living in ghettos and so on. So in Sheffield in 2005, a non-conformist preacher called Inderjit Bodal, who himself had been a refugee twice, moving from India to Uganda, and then brought from Uganda to England in the early 70s by his parents, saw that while there were formal and official structures for refugees, there was a house provided, there would be some basic support, that wasn't sufficient. And it didn't bring people together. It didn't enable refugees and asylum seekers to learn from each other. It didn't allow the community to be part of the process, part of the receiving process. So he formed a small group and called it Sheffield City of Sanctuary, and said, we are a place that welcome newcomers, incomers. First of all, refugees and asylum seekers, but beyond that, we welcome any stranger. We believe it is our duty to welcome the stranger. And that not only enables and enriches the stranger, but it also enriches the community in a way that we might come to later. You know, this is not a one-way process of people feeling sorry and empathetic and saying, like, come in and join us and we'll share what goods we have with you. It is much more generous and open than that. The concept took off, and particularly, obviously, in those cities and towns where there were substantial numbers of refugees, and people saw it as an addition to the sparse official provision that people were beginning to recognise was quite inadequate. And it gained a great deal of popularity as an idea when we first started getting waves of Syrian refugees, if you remember, back in around about 2014-ish, when Assad was bombing the big cities, Homs and Aleppo and so on. So there's the declaration in front of you states the core principles, and these are being revised at the moment. I'm actually speaking at the same time as the City of Sanctuary UK AGM is on. My wife has been sitting, participating in that all day, so I've missed out on most of that. But anyway, the core principles of City of Sanctuary are that all asylum seekers, refugees and migrants from wherever should be treated with dignity and respect. So we're not talking necessarily about forced refugees, although they'll always be top of our concern list. But we're also talking about any migrant, any person who chooses to come here, you know, whether it's from just down the road or whether it's from the other side of the world. A fair and effective process to decide whether people need protection should be in place. No one should be locked up indefinitely. No one should be left sick or destitute. And we should welcome the stranger and help them to integrate. Now, I think probably the first four of those are almost unarguable. The fifth one is getting a bit harder nowadays, because that is not, as you know, the government's view. So we'll see that there is an inevitable clash between our principles and those of the government, which has a lot of power, but not boundless power. Okay, so I'll just show you and say something about Lichfield. This is our particular brochure. And Lichfield, for those of you who don't know it, and I didn't really know it much, I've moved around the country. I was born and bred in northwest London, brought up really in Ealing in West London, went to college in Reading, then went to teach in North London, then in Leicestershire, where community colleges were very rife. Then from there, worked in Leicester itself at the university, then did a few years up on the far northwest tip of England, where I ran a secondary community school. And then we moved down to Southampton, where I ran a community education project. They're on the same railway line. You can get on a train in Carlisle and land up in Southampton in 6 hours. So as long as you take sandwiches, it's a very good ride. So we did that journey, and I was in we were in Southampton for a number of years. We set up this unique community education project, which was actually owned by the community. And then I became a freelance consultant, and since that time I haven't had a boss since 1989, and never will again, I think. So that's my background. And then we went to live in a small Somerset village where we brought up our youngest daughter, and we were there for 18 years. We did a lot of community work there, both in the immediate village, introducing the pinnacle of that was probably our India week that we did, because we happened to have some Indian friends. So we devoted the whole week to Indian activities from Bristol, musicians and so on, and all sorts of drama and art and so on. And most of the village, which was, you know, almost relentlessly white, apart from a Rastafarian barman in the local pub, it was quite an experience. Anyway, when our daughter left, and is now in Germany, we're going to visit her on Friday, we decided that we didn't want to live in a village anymore. We wanted to live in the sort of places that I'd worked mainly, like Birmingham and London and so on, and some of the more interesting and diverse communities. So we found Lichfield, and Lichfield is north of Birmingham. And it's a relatively, to our surprise, it turned out we should have done a bit more research, was rather more white and affluent than we'd expected. And in fact, I went to be a governor of a school here and toured the school, and the head said, oh, you know, we'd like you to join us. And I said, I've just got this question. I said, we came here to meet a more diverse culture, you know. And I said, we've just been round the school and I've seen one black face. And she said, this is Lichfield. And that phrase has haunted me ever since. This was sort of 4 years ago. People keep saying, oh no, it's not like that here. This is Lichfield, as if it is different from Wolverhampton and Walsall and North Birmingham and so on. So that was the first dilemma we had to face. How did we say, actually, maybe that's not quite what Lichfield is. Maybe it's different. And hence, we invited Inderjit Bodal in 2019 to come and talk to us from Sheffield. And from that, a small group set up Lichfield City of Sanctuary, which has a different brief to Sheffield and Liverpool and those other places where there are many refugees. Our brief really was to make Lichfield welcome ready for refugees. So it wasn't to deal with a problem that was here. It was to change or address the culture within the city that said, this is Lichfield. We are white, affluent, middle class, mainly male and proud. And our symbols are Samuel Johnson, who was born here, and Erasmus Darwin, who was a doctor here, and Elias Ashmole, the founder of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, is it? And those are our symbols, middle class, white men. So that's our challenge. So if we move on to slide 6, please. Oh yes, that's fine. That's the back end of the leaflet. If you can move on to the next one, please, Mark, that's it. So let's have a look at this. How welcoming is your community to incomers? How does it show, and what is the dominant culture? So I'll talk now for a couple of minutes about this. First of all, we need to say what do we mean by a community? Now, because people have written books and books about this, and you've probably read about Al Inslee on the west coast of America, and then Gramsci and so on, and people with their theorizing about what community is. I don't spend too much time on that, because I think as a community is what people perceive as being a community or not. So it may be that we're talking about a neighborhood. It may be that we're talking about the cul-de-sac in which I live, which has about 16 residences. But it might also be an organization. Village in the City in itself is a community. You are a community. It may be a scattered group of people sharing certain characteristics. So what do we mean by welcome readiness in a geographical community? That's what I'm going to focus on. Now, I'm told that 70% of people in the world live within 20 miles of where they were born, which means that 30% don't. And nearly a third of the world's population is on the move. That population is very likely to increase rapidly, with climate change tipping the barely habitable places in the world into uninhabitability. Possible responses to this include things like turning boats around to send them back to where they started, which you can do if you live on an island, but good luck if you have a very long coastline like we do. You can refuse to let them land, or you can shout at them, and you can invent wave machines that will push them back, or you can build camps and make them live like third world prisoners. Or you can recognize that this is a global issue, and you can attempt to address it globally, but also locally. And this is the bit where I'm talking about stepping forward and stepping back, because we need to step forward to say, this is what our locality can do, our community can do. But we, in a sense, what happens globally cannot be our business. Well, I mean, we may protest and we may speak about it, but we need to do the, what's the man's name, Mark? Stephen, the man who says, you know, circles of concern.
Stephen Covey.
Thank you very much. So we need to do the, you know, this is our concern. We can influence this bit. What's beyond, let's be clear about what it is that we're trying to do out there, because we probably have very little influence. So focus on the areas of concern. Okay, so we're all, as it turns out, we're all migrants. And I'm being told that the most truthful answer to the question, where are you from? If anybody ever asks you this, you should say probably Botswana or thereabouts. So remember that. In Britain, of course, it seems that most of our earliest inhabitants, including Cheddar Man, you've already heard of Cheddar Man, who was found in a gorge in Cheddar. I was going to say he was a big cheese in his time, but I won't. So Cheddar Man, who lived around about 10,000 years ago, was, I have to say, black. And so it might be worth reminding people of that when they start talking about, you know, who's entitled to come to this country and whose country it is. So we're all migrants, but how does your community welcome people, whether they're coming in from down the road, from a little neighborhood nearby you, or whether they're coming from the other side of the world? Do they get welcomed like the motor ship St. Louis was welcomed in Cuba and the United States and Canada in 1939, as it sailed around the world trying to find a refuge for 900 or so German Jews, and had to end up, and Great Britain did actually take quite a few, I think a couple of hundred people, bless us, but many of those people ended up in Antwerp, and in fact were sent back to Germany or were caught when they were in France or Belgium during the Second War. These extraordinary, you know, this new world of Cuba and the United States and Canada, whose job it was to take migrants, would have nothing to do with them. Or should we be more like a little village, or maybe a small town, which is right in the middle of central France, and it's called Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, and it became known for taking in Protestants in the 16th and 17th centuries, when after Henry IV, Henri IV, had taken on Catholicism, saying that Paris was worth a mass, in order to bring the country together and to solve this problem of the Reformation, and to say, people were entitled to their own religion. And he introduced the Edict of Nantes, which demanded tolerance for people of different religions. But soon after that, and certainly after Henry IV died, so that rapprochement fell apart, and the edict was revoked by Louis XIII, I think, and Protestants were told to leave the country, or had to leave the country. Now, I know a bit about this because that's my background. My family, the Ganns, actually were Huguenots, and they came over in small boats across the Channel and landed in southeast England, and mainly stayed there actually, in Whitstable, where they became oyster farmers. Le Chambon took in people because it was so isolated, and nobody really knew they were there, and it became a watchword for refuge. And there is a book which I can refer you to later. It then took in a lot of Jews in the 20th century. It harbored Jewish people throughout the Second World War, hundreds of them. And it's now taking in refugees from all over the world, and particularly from Syria and now Afghanistan, I think. So these communities, these groups of people, are developing their own responses to the possibility of welcome. Now, Lichfield doesn't have many visible refugees, but we have to ask whether this is cause or effect. Because much of the city is affluent, it hasn't been an obvious recipient of large numbers. There's very little, well, there's no public housing left, basically. Housing is expensive because GP lists, surgery lists and stall lists are full. Maybe because no one really wanted a richly diverse community, because then we'd look like Wolverhampton or Walsall or Leicester. And if we aren't ready for refugees, maybe we was thinking, well, they won't send us any, we can keep our heads down and avoid this global crisis. But now the neighbouring towns, Wolverhampton and Walsall, in the last couple of days have begun to notice that the wealthy areas of the country are not doing their fair share of taking the few refugees that we're agreeing to take now. So what pieces of human nature do we call on in order to do our bit for the receipt of migrants? The Afghan situation now does give us an opportunity to explore that question. And one of the issues, I think, when the Syrian crisis arose in 2014 and has continued since then, we have some Syrian families and work with them here. The emotions that were called upon, interestingly, were mainly empathy and pity. I've been told of a great big meeting that was held in the cathedral, hundreds or more people, all ready to say, yes, let's do what we can for the refugees and so on. It ended up as a small group of 5 people, one of whom is still working on that area. So empathy and pity by themselves may not be sufficient. It may not be the appropriate responses to people who come apparently carrying nothing. But of course, they are carrying enormous benefits with them. So what was rarely and not very publicly said those years ago was, what benefits does a community gain from inward migration? Now, we have 2 major tasks in Lichfield. One is we need to ensure that the district is ready and willing to receive refugees and asylum seekers, or any vulnerable person seeking sanctuary. We have a really active group which takes in women victims of domestic violence. We have groups that, that look at all sorts of issues, minority groups, so on, groups with health issues or groups with sexuality issues. So those people are here, and what they often need, first of all, is a very quick response. So we've put together a team which will be trained and properly prepared, and that will include members of the refugee community. They must always include members and be led by members of the minority community. And to address the immediate issues, so a Syrian refugee family that arrived 3 years ago now. Do you remember the Beast from the East, which was sort of March 2018? So 2 Syrian families arrived in the middle of the Beast from the East at Lichfield Trent Valley Station. They thought they were told they were going to Coventry, and they turned up in Lichfield. But somebody was there to meet them, and that's about it. Took them to a house, and there was a house there. I think it wasn't very well heated at the time. And they opened the fridge, and there was a vegetarian pizza and a tub of hummus. And that was a family of a husband and wife from Homs with 3 boys. So, you know, the vegetarian pizza and the tub of hummus weren't going to last very long during the Beast from the East. So that was the official response. And actually, our group, Lichfield Refugee Aid at the time, didn't hear about them for about a fortnight. So we're needing to set up a process whereby we hear about people, and where we hear about Afghan refugees, they can come to us. And we've got a team of people who can be in there the next day, who can be in there showing them where to shop, showing them where the schools are, introducing them to the GP surgeries, you know, and all of those sorts of things. So they're going to need short, medium and long-term support, which eventually leads to independence, but very slowly. At the moment, the Syrian system, the system for Syrians is 5 years. So some of our first Syrian families are now actually, in theory, independent of the system, because they've been here for 5 years, and they're now sort of let out. But in fact, of course, many of them aren't ready, not entirely. So it's important to get a balance with hospitality. How much do you give people, and how much do you enable them? How much do you step forward to give them things and provide for them? And then how, when and where and how do you step back and allow them to stand on their own 2 feet, if you like? So that's our first task, to make sure that we are welcome ready in that respect. But the other big task, and I think this is probably a national task, but we're going to focus on Lichfield, is about looking at the culture of the community. And we're going to think about what are the benefits of receiving incomes. Now, we're not going to just focus on economic benefits, although there are many, because we're not going to try and create a dichotomy of, you know, good refugees and bad refugees, because that really is pernicious. We mustn't, we have to think about how we can, well, if you like, educate, but I don't use that word, educate people to see that a rich and diverse culture is much more interesting, exciting and rewarding. We've had a couple of examples recently about how the door is just needs to be pushed because it's already open. Last year, before lockdown, just before lockdown, Lichfield District Council published its tourism documents every year. You know, visit Lichfield, they do, and lots of pictures and so on. Of course, many of them online, but also hard copies. Lots of photographs of this very attractive city, I saw those online, and I rang the office and I spoke to the woman who was in charge of this, and I said, you know, I don't want to be difficult, but is Lichfield only white? Are there really only white people here? Because all your tourism pictures are of white people, and isn't there anybody who's in a wheelchair or anything like that? Because all your people, all these pictures are of healthy, white, apparently quite middle-class people doing middle-class things, you know, visiting Samuel Johnson's birthplace, you know, and sitting in a park listening to an orchestra and so on. And, you know, I thought, oh, she's going to say, oh, don't be silly, you know. And she said, good God, she said, you're right. She said, I used to work for a local authority where we were much better at this sort of thing. And we took great care of making sure we showed how diverse the community was. and she said, thank you. And a year later, earlier this year, I looked at the newly published ones in March, the newly published Visit Lichfield. And it focuses on a black couple walking around the city and looking at things and going in for cups of coffee and chatting to people. And there's wheelchairs and there's large groups of people, and there are people of different colours and so on in there. And I thought, wow, we have had an impact, even a little thing like that. So addressing the local authorities, sitting down with the local authorities, which we do now. And we're on first name terms with all the leaders of the parties and so on. We're relentlessly Tory here, I'm afraid. I don't use the word we to include myself.
Nigel, can I just say this is fantastic stuff. We're loving it. We've got 15 minutes left.
I'm just coming to the end.
I want to make sure there's a little bit of time for some questions and discussion.
I'm just coming. It's okay. Yeah, I'm on the last. I've got 3 lines to do, I think.
Okay.
So 2 examples, and the other example is about a newspaper report on travellers. I don't know how your community responds to travelling families, but whenever it comes up in Lichfield, people are saying, oh, what are they doing? They call the councillors. There was a Birmingham Mail report on a travelling family, headlines online of the councillors and the residents and the police who had all turned up. And there wasn't a word about the travellers. And when I emailed the editor, I expected to be told, no, that's nonsense. And she said, you're quite right. We've taken the story down. Thanks for your email. So we're pushing at open doors about welcome readiness. So slide 8, is that slide 8?
That is slide 8.
Perfect, thank you. So those are the questions. How welcome ready is your community? What aspects of your community might work in favour of welcome readiness? And what aspects might work against welcome readiness? You need to define those before you say, what are we about to do? What can we do to make our community more open, more inclusive, and more actually community-like? Full stop.
And there's Nigel's homework slide, everyone, just to see about even more things you can ask yourself. And here's his closing slide of 2 faces of Lichfield, the pretty green place and the discarded sleeping bag outside Oxfam. So, Nigel, thank you so much indeed for that. Your 10 minutes of
I know
of wittering turned, but that wonderful stuff. It's a small group today, everyone, and I see applause coming on here. It's a small group today, so let's see first of all if there are any questions for Nigel, and then we'll open it up into a kind of discussion for everybody to get involved with. So first of all, questions for Nigel, please. Just unmute and ask away. Sounds like the dog's getting involved there.
I think the dog wanted to ask the question.
Yes.
I've just closed the door on her. Is there a decent pub around you in Lichfield where we can come and sit and have a long natter?
Yes, plenty of them. Yes, and it's a bit of a fag to get. You have to change at London, won't you, somewhere, and across London. But anyway, no, it'd be lovely to see you. Yes. Do you have contact details for me if people do want to email me?
You can put them in the chat, Nigel. That would be great.
I'll do that.
If you could do that. Yes. I put the website of City of Sanctuary, which is the sort of overall website of City of Sanctuary, in the chat. That's cityofsanctuary.org. People are listening to this, cityofsanctuary.org, and you can get to the Lichfield group through that. But it may well be easier just to contact Nigel directly, and I'm sure he'd be very delighted to hear from people interested in this topic.
Sorry, Jenny, you go.
I was just going to say, I was one of the people who had never heard of City of Sanctuary, and I just went to that website. Edinburgh, where I live, is a city of sanctuary.
Yeah.
So I'm going to look at some of those questions that you asked. We're not a major hub, Glasgow is, because Glasgow has the characteristics that you talked about. Edinburgh is white and middle class. but anyway, we describe ourselves as a city of sanctuary, and I liked your question, how welcoming is it, and how does it show? And I think that it's just a bit more than putting a strap line on a website, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I've already decided that I need to send that information to our local councillors in case they don't already know about it, and that's my local councillors in Eastbourne. Hastings is a city of sanctuary, which actually makes quite a lot of sense. Brighton makes quite a lot of sense, and also a tiny little village. I think it was East Hoathley, which is just up the road from here. It's also the city of sanctuary, and Eastbourne isn't. And it should be, but I understand why it's not. But I think it's one of the things that our local councillors need to be looking at, and potentially, and also our MPs. Our MPs should be looking at that as well. If they don't already know, they should know.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've been very vocal about this. I wrote to Mark. This was absolutely music to my ears, and it makes me feel really emotional at the same time. It's wonderful to listen to you, Nigel.
Absolutely. Yeah. So perhaps we've got just 10 minutes left. Let's open it up into a discussion. I'd be very keen to hear from people briefly, perhaps what's touched you about from today's presentation, what's made you think, what are you thinking at the moment? So, and we've got time for everyone who wants to have a go. So let me open it up.
Well, I was touched by the small steps story, the conversations. Says, gosh, this brochure looks a bit, and as you described it, pushing on open doors. Yeah. And not only did your people say, oh yeah, we better do something about that. Not only did they say that, they did apparently do something about it. So it's making me think about how does this show these great things, and it's in little things. And I think one of my tasks, I think, for tomorrow is what kind of little things would help to show a welcoming environment.
We're trying to support one of the families, one of the couples, with the one with 3 boys, to set up their own business, and they've been understandably very ambivalent for a couple of years, and especially through lockdown. I mean, it's really made their absorption into the community really problematic. But they are interested, and they were business people. Ibrahim owned a couple of shops and quite a bit of property in Homs, all of which is flattened now. So he knows about business. He didn't know about business in this country. So they're both good cooks, as a lot of Syrian people appear to be for some reason, or the ones who come here are. And they suddenly became, after long conversations, they said, yeah, we would like to sort of start making Syrian food. It's not that common here, Middle Eastern food. You can go down to New Street Station and eat Lebanese food and so on, but not in Lichfield, which is we're now being told is one of the best dining places in the country. So they've set up a little organisation called Syrian Food in Lichfield, and we said, okay, we have a Lichfield Food Festival at the end of August. So we said, well, we'll raise the money to pay for a stall for you, which is 180 quid for the 3 days. But it's a big event, and Lichfield is packed for 3 days. So we said, we'll have an event, and we'll get people to donate, and we'll invite people, just 30 or 40 people, but we'll invite the leader of the district council and the leader of the city council and the Labour leaders and various other community leaders, as well as the ordinary people who are members of the City of Sanctuary. And Ibrahim and Shahira will make some of their food, just snacks, and we'll ask you to donate. We'll see if we can raise 180 quid for you to at least buy a stall, and then we'll look at how we can help you set it up. We raised 183 quid in cash in the space of an hour, while people were also donating online straight into the organisation's bank account. And at the end, a chap I hadn't met before, but from the food bank, interestingly, came and said, do you know the chap who organises the food festival? I said, no. And he said, well, I know him quite well, and I think he'd like to contribute to this. So shall I get in touch with him? And I said, oh, yeah, please. So I got home, and half an hour later, I got an email to say that the organiser wanted to donate the stall to Ibrahim and Shahira free of charge. So they had 180 quid or 183 quid to go and spend on business cards and ingredients and so on. And they had a wonderful time. And, you know, a couple of days afterwards, a chap rang me from a local law firm saying, could I put them in touch with the people who ran the food stall that was right outside their office over the bank holiday weekend, because they'd like to engage them to do some catering for them and so on. So they're off. And as you say, quite a small thing in the beginning, but maybe, you know, when they are multi-millionaires, catering millionaires, and they've turned Lichfield into the centre of Middle Eastern food for the United Kingdom, you know, maybe I'll go along and ask them for a loan. You know?
Thank you, Nigel. That's terrific stuff. And it's interesting how food is so often a bridging point in these days.
Yes, yes.
You know, it's a wonderful way that people can, ordinary people can bring their culture and their thing in a nice way that everyone can engage with. And so with hosting, you find this again and again. Food and drink, being together. It's just a natural way things happen.
Yeah.
One thing we're thinking here in Edinburgh West End, we are a kind of relatively middle classy kind of place, particularly in the Scottish context. But one thing we're trying to do, we've been stymied by COVID so far. We want to have newcomers get-togethers, invite people, say, who've arrived in the neighbourhood in the last, let's say, 3 months, or you put a thing on it, and say, look, come along. There's a pub which will give us a room. They'll even provide a few glasses or something. You know, if you're new to the neighbourhood, come and say hello. Come and meet some of the locals. Come meet each other. And we'll do that, you know, once a quarter or something like that, just to see who we can engage with. And it seems a relatively straightforward thing to try, but of course you need to get to the people. That's the challenge. So our Facebook group, which has grown, as I told you, from 20 to 1200, is one way to get that. But you get the people in the group to find other people who've just arrived, the neighbours or people down the stair, to say, look, I hear there's going to be a newcomers get together. Why don't you go along and say hi? Because if you don't know about the folk, the rest of it just doesn't work at all. So that making that point of contact seems to me to be the really key first step. And if that doesn't happen, then everything else becomes difficult.
I've come across several villages, and in fact, the one that we moved into in 1999 was one of them. That I've said, do you welcome newcomers? Because in villages it's very easy; everybody knows, you know, who's moved into the new house and so on. And a couple of them have said, "Oh, we used to do that, and I don't know what happened to it." And you know, the idea of just turning up with a little brochure saying, "Here's the contact, here's the good place to shop," is, you know, the sort of place you find when you go on a self-catering holiday. And inside there's all this. Now you're going there for a week or a fortnight, and there's masses of information about places to visit and food and where the petrol is and all the rest of it. And yet when you move into a house in a new community to live there forever, nobody tells you the blindest little thing about it, which seems very odd, really, and irrational. So that every community, whether it's a street or a neighborhood or a city, should at least have a welcome pack.
Yeah. That's a great idea. Welcome pack would be a great first step, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing. So we just got just last 2 minutes. Let me just offer the chance to people who haven't spoken yet or haven't said very much. Brian, Leah, Pam, if you're hearing us, do feel free to jump in and say something or ask a question, whatever you'd like.
Brian, you're mute. Is it?
Common mistake, handheld. Anyway, thank you was what I wanted to say. I've enjoyed listening to you. I also would like a conversation at some point, and I will probably write to you if that's okay. Oh,
And Nigel, you're mute now. There we go.
Yeah, I put my thanks. I put my personal email up there, so
thank you.
Yes.
I'd love to hear from you.
Email in the chat there, nigel.gann@haybarn.plus.com, and Nigel's not that hard to find online too. And you can also get to him, I think, through the City of Sanctuary website as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Right. Well, folks, we're just coming up to our time. So let me first of all say thank you very much indeed to Nigel for a really stimulating and engaging session. Bravo, bravo. Thank you so much. And Nigel mentioned that there's lots of takeaways from this. You know, it sounds like a big thing, welcoming refugees or something like that. It sounds like an enormous thing, but actually there's all sorts of things we can do to welcome people of all kinds, newcomers of all kinds. As you said, Nigel, if they're moving from the next neighborhood along, or if they're moving from halfway around the world, you know, the same kind of principles apply probably. This is very, very stimulating. So folks, thank you to Nigel. This call recording will be online fairly soon. Remember, our next call is in just 3 weeks today, the 13th of October. I'll talk more about hosting and what good hosts do, what I've learned over the last 20 years about that. Our course starts on the 19th of October. And of course, you can join our Village in the City community as well. Many of you on this call are in that community, but if you're not, please do join it. It's where all the conversations go on and the resources are shared and so on. So do join that if you can. Nigel, thank you so much. Everybody else, thank you so much.
Good to meet you.
And I'm going to stop the recording.
Bye, everybody.